Are we heading for a hung parliament, first of all, Danny?
It's not obvious at all because there was an awful lot of tactical voting, whatever Lisa and Andy may have said. And I think that'll persist. While the motivating force in politics is, as it is now, vote against the Conservatives, get rid of the Conservatives. If the Conservatives can't mute that more than they have, then that will be important at the next general election, whatever anybody says about discouraging it. I do think going round and round the subject and making assumptions is a bit pointless. I was on Newsnight a couple of days before the same election, and I was in 2015, and I was with David Gauke, and Evan Davis kept pressing David Gauke on what he would do in a hung parliament. David Gauke said the Conservatives would get a majority. Evan Davis said, "Don't be ridiculous," and this is exactly what politicians always do. You won't answer my question. And of course, afterwards, Evan very kindly sent him a note, actually saying how sorry he was that he'd pressed him on that in that way. But actually, although we can it can take up too much airtime, it's still pretty important. However, in the case of Labour and the Liberal Democrats, if the Labour Party had to govern with the Liberal Democrats as another party in Parliament, why would it make any concessions to them at all? And why would it even be a cause of instability any more than any group of MPs is when you've got a majority? So I'm not convinced. I think with the Scottish Nationalists, there's a different matter because they would call for a referendum, and they, I suppose, could pull out on a UK government that didn't give them a referendum, and that would be a source of destabilisation. But the Liberal Democrats have got no negotiating position at all.
I think that's the really relevant difference with 2015. There's a few different factors, but I think the really relevant difference is that 2015, what the Conservatives were saying about Ed Miliband's Labour is that they would be in hoc to Alex Salmond, and that was just 9 months after the Scottish independence referendum had been the main news story throughout the UK. So people knew who Alex Salmond was, in parts of the UK at least, knew that they didn't like him, that he wanted to break up the UK, that was a looming threat. And it played into this idea of Ed Miliband being weak as well. So it all sort of came together as a coherent argument. And also, the Conservatives, albeit in coalition, had delivered 5 years of fairly stable government. So it was a sort of genuine contrast they could offer. This time round, if Rishi Sunak tries to make that argument against Keir Starmer, firstly, Keir Starmer can just say, well, hang on, how can you accuse us of chaos after what's happened under your majority government, minority government, small majority government? Actually, the most stable government the Conservatives delivered since 2010 was in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. But the other point, exactly as Danny alludes to, is there's something a bit different between Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket or, don't vote for Keir Starmer because he might give Ed Davey more money to remove sewage from the rivers. I just don't think it will quite have the same purchase.
You're right.
And it's actually interesting, a bit later on we're going to hear from Stephen Bush talking about the Labour Party and the polling that we've got. And he says actually Keir Starmer might rather be in coalition with Ed Davey than being in coalition with John McDonnell, with a small Labour majority in hoc to the hard left. That actually David Cameron found it much easier in government with Nick Clegg than he did with a very small majority and everything that unfolded after that.
You have to be in coalition with both, right? So during David Cameron's government, he had the support both of the Liberal Democrats and of the right of the Conservative Party. And if either of those groups had abandoned him, he wouldn't have a majority. So I don't actually think it's going to be a choice. If you're the Prime Minister, you're going to have to balance those things. But the Liberal Democrats are often not a balance to any part of the left. Insofar as they will put pressure on the Labour Party, which isn't much, it'll be to go further on things and to sort of try to leap over Labour and looking virtuous and looking like they're on the left. We can see how it will work because it happens all the time in the House of Lords. When the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats vote together, the Conservatives can never win. But sometimes the Liberal Democrats decide they're going to vote against something that the Labour Party merely abstains on, on those votes, the government does win. So the Liberal Democrats will be in a position where it's very rarely the case that they share the Conservative view against the Labour government. Most of the time they'll probably be in coalition with John McDonnell, making a bit more trouble for Keir Starmer.
And I think that speaks to one really important change between the 2010-2015 period of, the last time the Liberal Democrats were a major force and now, which is that the Liberal Democrats are now avowedly an anti-Tory party. And you've seen this in Ed Davies, Sir Ed Davey, who is a knight for his stint as a cabinet minister in the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. But you've seen this in Ed Davies' comments since Thursday. They are the alternative to the Tories in parts of the country where Labour are not an alternative to the Tories. So you don't have that sort of equidistance, or, wherever you want to put them on the spectrum, that you previously had with the Liberal Democrats. People voting for the Liberal Democrats at the general election will be voting for Keir Starmer ultimately to be Prime Minister. And I think that takes us back to an important question about interpreting the local election results. So the John Curtis view, and guru John Curtis, is that Labour did very well, but because their vote share stood broadly still compared to last year's locals, and it was the Liberal Democrats who mostly advanced, that means that Keir Starmer is unlikely to get a majority. And I'm sure that's true, but I'd just add a sort of grace note to that, which is that I think what the local elections showed is a willingness on the part of the vast numbers of people who are not currently Conservative supporters to vote for whoever the local alternative to the Conservatives is, and that means the Labour vote. Yes, it's not at 40%; it's at 35%, but it is more efficient than it's been at any point since the sort of late Blair period. They're not piling up votes in cities anymore.
This is the result of several years of deliberate Conservative strategy designed to lose power. And this strategy is to try to unite everybody else against you when you don't have enough most of the time to form majority government. And because you did once, because Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, making coalitions with other parties very difficult, and Brexit was an issue. But the strategy that the Conservative Party has embarked on, which Rishi Sunak is only partially unravelling, which is to try to swivel the Conservative body to win red wall seats and to antagonise others as being part of a sort of metropolitan elite that have drifted away from the majority view of the country, when these are kind of middle-class architects living in Hertsmere and who haven't got any political view at all. That strategy, is suicidal, and I've been trying to say this for quite a long time. It is a realignment that will work for a little bit, but is ultimately, potentially fatal for the Conservative Party, and certainly keep them out of power for longer than it keeps them in. And so these local election results, people said, they were very bad for the Conservatives but quite good for Labour. There isn't such a thing, right? If they're bad for the Conservatives, that means it's good for the centre-left, right? And the centre-left can be called Labour, it can be called Liberal Democrats. It's basically the centre-left, and the Conservatives cannot win unless it's good for the Conservatives, and anything else is not good for them. So my view is that these local elections were worse than they looked, and they look really bad. That what they're suggesting is defeat almost where anyone can impose it, which is a deliberate choice the Tory Party has made. They've deliberately unified a part of the Liberal centre with the centre-left, assuming that because they last time has said that sort of Liberal centre voted with them because of Jeremy Corbyn, it would go on doing so, but that's obviously not going to happen.
And I suppose that's the big difference between now or next year and 2010. So in 2010 there was a realistic prospect that the Lib Dems could go with either Labour or the Conservatives, albeit the Labour numbers were really tough. But it gave them some purchase, and it gave them, they played them off each other, and they got a lot of concessions from the Conservatives. Were they to hold the balance of power next time out, the Lib Dems aren't going to say to Keir Starmer, well, I could put Rishi Sunak back in government. That's not... So on the one hand, they might... And the other thing is, I think they're on the record as saying that their red line for going into a coalition would be to demand proportional representation. And it's not clear that Keir Starmer's ready for that either.
I think a point that is just not sufficiently appreciated in Westminster is that a hung parliament, in almost any configuration I can conceive of, equals Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Yeah. So when Conservatives or commentators say, but Keir Starmer didn't do well enough in these local elections to be short of a Blair-style majority, by which they're actually saying Keir Starmer didn't do enough in these local elections to display himself as the greatest electoral alchemist, to sort of, person capable of swinging support on the level of sort of Eastern European dictator. I mean, what a hung parliament means is Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Yeah. I mean, it is utterly inconceivable that either the Liberal Democrats or the SNP would do anything other than say, yes, we'll make you Prime Minister and then we'll bargain afterwards.
I share your bewilderment that this is insufficiently appreciated, because it seems like a sort of fairly obvious fact. The Conservative Party has now got to win a majority in order to stay in power. And so therefore when you talk to people about who's likely to win, you're often talking to people who were estimating the chances of a Labour majority against the chances of the Conservative Party staying in power, and thinking those things are relatively even. But when you take the chances of the Labour Party, of the Conservative Party just staying in power by winning a majority, you can see the chances are pretty small.
Could I get one more thing that's annoyed me over the recent days?
Good.
A rival broadcaster is obsessed with comparisons to how Tony Blair was doing at an equivalent point in the electoral cycle, and it just could not be more different. In 1992, a famous victory for John Major, but Labour came pretty close to a hung parliament, right? So Tony Blair, post-Black Wednesday in 94, 95, 96, he didn't need to be as popular as he was. Yes, in 1996, he was doing far better than Keir Starmer's doing now. But that was the difference between being in a big majority or the enormous landslide that he ended up with. Keir Starmer does not need that. Keir Starmer just needs to be, a majority of one. A hung parliament, by the way, would be extraordinary compared to where Labour were in December 2019.
I think that's really interesting. The unspoken implication of all the Tory responses to the local elections, they haven't done as well as they need to, is the baseline of where we are now of Keir Starmer falling short of a majority government, given that 5 years ago we weren't sure that the Labour Party had a future as a going concern.
Yeah, although I always thought that was hyperbolic. By the way,
did.
so
That's true.
And Henry's generous enough to say I did. So my view was that the Conservative Party had been in several times, and it was always quite likely to be a swing against it. And it was clear there was a big wodge of it that was to do with Corbyn and to do with Brexit. It's a question of whether you think that the realignment in which Labour voters former Labour voters end up voting for Conservative is going to last in circumstances where much of the Conservative Party isn't interested in their economic agenda and wants to go indeed in the opposite direction. Let's leave aside what's then happened, with chaos, with the chaos that's taken place due to other reasons that are not strategic and not philosophical. If you just look at the disconnect between what the Conservative Party kind of members of Parliament want to do and what the voters they acquired want to do, you could see that there was going to be quite a large likelihood it wouldn't be able to maintain itself in power beyond a period, even though it won a big majority.
I think the main thing we've established is there's a lot of witlessness in Westminster punditry, which can't remember anything more than about 5 minutes ago, and always thinks that the last thing is the thing that's set in stone. So the Tory majority in 2015, the coalitions are going to be here forever, and then the Tories won a majority. Then that was set in stone, and then the Tories are finished now because of Theresa May, and then they won a majority, and now everyone thinks those red wall seats will never go back. Well, they did. It was a big shock when they swung. Well, when they always swing back the other way. Dan's been in touch, Danny. Dan in Poole, as a centre-right Conservative, surely Danny's politics are closer to the Lib Dems than the current Tory party position.
No, they aren't, and there are lots of different reasons for that. Although I must admit to you that there's been a period in which the Conservative Party has definitely moved away from the position that I have. But I took the view after my experience in the SDP, I was on the national executive of the SDP, that being in a political party, a small political party where most people agree with you, and even then finally you didn't agree with everything, you'd inevitably not win power. It turned out that there weren't very many kind of Jewish sons of control engineers from Hendon to go round demographically. So you need to be in a coalition with people you don't agree with, and when you are, sometimes you're closer to them, and sometimes you're not. So my view is, in the long term, the centre. I'm on the centre right, and sometimes, at the moment, the Conservative Party under Rishi Sunak has moved a little bit back towards my position. Certainly under Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, who moved away from it.
Well, moved away from almost everybody.